At the end of the day, what makes a difference and what can move big agendas? And my conclusion was it is the economy and it is security. And we needed to link up with these agendas. However, I always resisted that to frame, as some have done, particularly in the US, not in Europe at all, AIDS or health as a classic security issue about war and peace and so on. Of course, epidemics historically have sometimes determined the outcome of armed conflicts. We know that. But that's, for me, was a very tricky basis and not sustainable.
Welcome to the Global Health Diplomats. I'm Ben Plumley, the British one.
And I'm Eric Goosby, the nice one.
Oh, Eric, it's good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Ben.
So one of the things we've been exploring around global health diplomacy is the role of primary healthcare. And it's something that, I don't know, doesn't seem to get a lot of attention. Whether it's because it's nurses, it's general practitioners, it's community health workers. It's not the cutting edge science, but it doesn't seem to be a central part of our discussions around how we make health a truly effective vehicle for improvements in the global security agenda more broadly. Why do you think that is?
You know, I think that people don't realize the complexity of taking a new idea, a new discovery, and getting it to the people who will benefit from it. That cascade of relationships from both institutions and with individuals in different communities within a given country is a complex orchestration, and one that needs attention kind of constantly, or it atrophies. And it's not sexy and flashy, but on the other hand, it is the only conduit through which the science will benefit those who need it. And I think that as scientists, as clinicians, and as diplomats in government and outside of government, this is a critical need that we all contribute to. It's not one sector that does it. It's everyone together will put that capability and sustain it. UN multilateral systems are an outside ultrastructure that comes in and helps support that, in addition to what countries can generate on their own and civil society can generate on their own. The truth is that people are not used to working together, and a lot of the effort goes into creating platforms and systems so discussions can identify met and unmet needs, prioritize those unmet needs, and then deploy resources toward them. Until the surveillance and data collection is rich enough to allow for that description of what is happening or is not happening in HIV, TB, whatever disease you want to identify, you do not get the creation of a responsive delivery system. And people feel that it's not their responsibility, so pieces of it atrophy in real time. So it is quite a challenge.
And, you know, you and I suppose this is an area of ever so slight disagreement. I was really moved during COVID that the cadre of community health workers that had been built up through the investments of the Global Fund, for example, and of course PEPFAR, but that they were being mobilized, really frontline workers, to lead in the response to COVID. And our good friend Prasada Rao was saying that, you know, we had lost the lives of so many frontline community health workers, not adequately supporting them or giving them the protective equipment that they needed. I've always been a huge champion of community health workers, but you're not so supportive as it relates to them being the primary driver of community, of frontline care, are you? There's a need for medicine to be driving this, not community.
You know, I have spent much of my professional career with Ryan White, initially in the United States, and later with PEPFAR, acknowledging and seeking community orchestration as the complementary piece. The emphasis on going to planning councils that were in and of the community, made up of providers and patients and the infrastructure people at the table to discuss what was needed. But most importantly, after the unmet need was defined, what should we do in resource allocation? How should we prioritize that? That discussion is critical with those specific people. And creating that capability has been a focus of my personal career, because community outreach and community workers can't replace the medical, diagnostic, nurses, doctors, laboratory need. That's what we're trying to align with and access. That needs to be excellent, but it will not sustain itself if there isn't that enabling service ring around the core primary care delivery system that continues to identify and retain patients in care over the duration. And it's that kind of, those different components need to be put together. And to me, the forum for that is in global health diplomacy, because it's the interface of governments with community, with private sector, and with philanthropy in a way that others aren't. So you need to grab the space.
And again, what a wonderful way, Eric, you have of setting us up for our big interview in this episode. Because the person we're speaking to, and it's an interview I did again back at the World Health Assembly in May, is with our good friend, Professor Peter Piot, who was the founding executive director of UNAIDS, and is now a senior advisor on health to the president of the European Commission. And he is a person who has lived the values that you've just articulated.
He has indeed.
And I think it's an interesting interview, and I'm really, really, really fascinated to see what you're going to make of it, in the way that he takes the lessons learned from HIV and applies them to COVID. And again, this I'd be interested to see how you see his approach to primary healthcare in this. What would you hope to hear from Peter?
Well, I think it is just what you've said, Ben. Peter does sit in this unique position of having a lot of upfront programmatic experience that informs and enriches his ability to know what the burden is going to be when you engage in a dialogue with government, with civil society, and the inability to sustain that dialogue if there are not platforms or conveners that continue to be available. Peter has been often the glue in those systems, as have you been in your work with UNAIDS, but also with the rest of your career and Pangea in particular, very much trying to put those pieces together of government, civil society, with philanthropy to get over the hump. But at all times, Peter kept it focused on getting and establishing a concrete delivery system as the final output. And his ability to do that, I think, built the ultrastructure on which a more substantive response could be begun and expanded. And I think he should really, as you should, feel good about the fact that you were both very much part of articulating what that need was.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Eric. But of course, I follow in yours and Peter's footsteps, and very much sit on your shoulders. We were both at Pangea. But why don't we listen to what Peter has to say and then come back at the end and offer some final thoughts?
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, Peter, welcome to the Global Health Diplomats.
Well, that's the first one for me.
Yes, well, it's the new podcast series that Eric Goosby and I have put together, and really looking at the role of global health diplomacy. And he and I felt that during this trip of mine to Europe, we should really catch you and get your thoughts. And thank you for hosting us in your beautiful home here in Belgium, in Brussels. It's just absolutely lovely.
No, we're lucky. Yes.
And I'm also glad to have got you out of the garden where you have been planting roses and creating an absolutely beautiful oasis. So,
in between 100 emails and 15 Zoom calls. But anyway, yes, It keeps me sane.
And we're recording this just prior to both of us, in fact, going to the World Health Assembly in Geneva. And first up, I suppose I should congratulate you on the award from Dr. Tedros, the Director General at WHO, on behalf of WHO, that is going to you and to Jean-Jacques Muyembe Tamfum from DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, a Lifetime Achievement Award. It feels very Oscars. What is the award for?
Well, I was frankly very surprised when Dr. Tedros called me, but I was very pleased and also relieved when he said that the other laureate was my good friend and older brother, Jean-Jacques Muyembe, whom I've known for probably about 40 years, no more than that. And it's a life achievement award, so it's not for a particular achievement, but for everything we've been doing, a lot of it together, Jean-Jacques and I, over the years of our career. So I'm very happy with this recognition, because the relationship with WHO has not always been an easy one, particularly in the early days of UNAIDS, when the then leadership of WHO did really not want to deal with this problem.
Oh, yes. And you've covered that beautifully in your set of memoirs about your time dealing with Ebola and with the creation of UNAIDS. Do you get to speak? Is there an award ceremony?
Yes, so that's in no time to lose. I go into that in pretty much detail. Yeah, it's at the World Health Assembly opening ceremony, after, I think, 20 speeches by various ministers. And because, let's not forget, this is to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the World Health Organization, and an institution that the world desperately needs, and that has had, a major impact on health for people, not only in low-income countries, but everywhere.
Mm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you've sort of said it there, and I'm sort of interested in your vision for WHO, a very forward-looking vision. You've talked about the august history, some of which, it was sort of almost old before its time. It was old when it was established at the end of the 40s, but very traditional, very medical, and at times it's had a hard time adapting to the changes in the way health is provided, but also the health challenges that we face. But going forward, what do you think the role of WHO is?
Well, if WHO would not exist, it would have to be created. That's for sure. It probably would look a bit different today when it was created, but the world needs a place where everybody, including countries that are at war with each other, can come together and go beyond the that kind of differences or whether they're violent or not, and make sure that what is absolutely the foundation for humanity, that's health, can be discussed and can be improved. And so what WHO can do, and nobody else, is that it's a neutral convener. It's an institution that can make recommendations, be it on the best treatment for disease X, to approaches to improve the health system, to ensure that there is equity in access to care. That's the so-called normative role, and that nobody can do, because WHO is neutral in terms of the national interest and commercial interests. So that is unique, and nobody else can do that. And I think that's very precious. Secondly, the world needs an advocate for health, and at the global level, and of course at the community level and any level. But bringing that together is also WHO's real function. And then thirdly, I would say, is to a role in times of crisis, be it humanitarian crisis linked to war, and let's not forget, but natural disasters, but also, of course, pandemics. And that is where I think WHO recently has done a better job than in the past, thanks to Dr. Tedros' leadership. But that's very different, because that's an operational role, which is very different to the basic role of WHO, the normative one, and the advocacy, which is not very operational. I don't think that WHO has much to offer in terms of research, because there are academic institutions that are much better equipped for that. And it is actually even could be considered a conflict of interest to do the research and then to judge that research in the same institution and say this was wonderful and that's what we recommend. That has to be separated. But overall, I think, can you imagine a world without WHO? It would be we would be much, much worse off, to put it negatively. And now the challenge will be for WHO also to go beyond the traditional approaches, the biomedical approaches, when we are confronted with the impact on health of climate change, for example, which is absolutely going to be mind-blowing. And I think we're putting our head in the sand. Also, the changing demographics, except for Africa, where there is still a major increase in population, but in other parts of the world, declining populations, healthy longevity should be high on the agenda. How do we do that? And then the structural determinants of health. So there's a huge agenda, and therefore we all need to support it.
So you are basically there may be some constructive criticism there, but you're a fan and a supporter of WHO. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you said. The first, I guess, is around the core responsibilities and whether there are issues of mission creep with WHO. You mentioned research, and that's clearly one area where gamekeeper can't be poacher, where you can't, your credibility in evaluating research and data for clinical guidelines that many countries use as a baseline can't be colored, let's say, by research that that your institution have done. That seems a very, very obvious and quite dangerous potential conflict of interest. But other mission creeps. Now, an area that you and I have worked on over many years, and feel free to say, Ben, bugger off, I'm not talking about this, but the idea of WHO becoming a regulatory body, a global regulatory body, and we've had some steps around that with pre-qualification. And I just wonder, whether you think that is something that WHO should indeed be, developing its skill set on.
First of all, let me stress that science is the basis for the action of WHO, together for, let's say, with human rights and the, advocating for equity in health. But the science base should not be mixed up with, generating the science. And so there need to be scientists and the scientific evidence as the basis for the policy recommendation. That should be very clear. On the regulatory board, it's very complex because regulatory bodies such as the European Medicines Agency and the FDA, and hopefully soon also the African Medicines Agency and national authorities, they are quite independent from, from other instances that set policy and so on. And it's a very complex issue. And so WHO is not stricto sensu a regulator, but there are, based on their policy recommendations, then, pre-qualification and so on. And I think that's a gray area for me, and where we should be really very careful. And it's extremely important because, for example, for the procurement of vaccines, by Gavi or UNICEF, for all kinds of interventions, they have to rely on WHO recommendations. But for me, that's not regulatory approval, but it can take enormously long. I see, for example, for how long it has taken for WHO to recommend bed nets that incorporate insecticides that are, going beyond the ones that are, against which mosquitoes are resistant. So this is not an academic process. So it's something that it's not a yes or a no.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. So this podcast is about exploring how to make global health essentially a central pillar of the international security agenda. You mentioned it, and I think it's pretty clear now that everything has to be framed against the bedrock of the climate emergency. But, other areas, COVID-19, for example, showed us the importance of taking One Health very seriously. The idea that animals and humans getting closer in contact together, that has some particular threats as it comes to potentially new pandemic threats, but also economic prosperity and security, peace for all. And I'd like to sort of test out your ideas on global health diplomacy by looking at your experience of leading the global AIDS response at a really crucial time, the moment when we moved from millions to billions of dollars of investment, to use your phrase, but also where
the M word to the B word. I remember. Yeah.
Yes, the M word to the B word, and that could be misinterpreted in so many ways. But you really were able to leverage a moment in time, 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, essentially, and with people like Richard Holbrooke, with people like Kofi Annan, and there were many others, you were able to make this a moment where the world turned to an infectious disease killing millions, but one that thrived on the most private of human behaviors. And I really wonder how you were able to do that. And if I may just kick off with one particular question, which relates actually to the broader conversation about WHO. The WHO is basically a membership organization, and its members are ministers of health. And I guess the question for you would be really how you were able both to mobilize them, but also go to their decision makers, because at the end of the day, ministers of health are fairly low on the pecking order in governments.
A few comments. There are lots of questions there. First of all, you said in the beginning that health is part of security. I would only agree with that statement if we mean human security, a concept that Japan launched last century already, but not the classic security. And human security, that includes being protected from ill health, but also it includes equity and so on. So it's not only the crisis, not only the epidemics. And then I agree that that's in there. And that has a number of consequences if you look at that. And that is, for example, that WHO and the Ministries of Health, and WHO, you can argue, is the Ministry of Health for the world. And we need that to implement, to make sure that where the money is going, that it makes sense, is well spent, and it reaches those who are most vulnerable, and so on. But in order to put something really on the agenda, you need the prime ministers, you need the presidents or the kings or whoever, the heads of state and government. And that's what we did with AIDS. And it was partly because we didn't make much progress, and partly because I was also seeing a lot of reluctance to deal with the difficult issues that are associated with AIDS, difficult in the eyes of some, because it's about sex, about drugs, and so on. And that's a difficult issue for many individuals, and certainly in some countries. Let's not forget that there is still a death penalty on homosexuality in some countries. And we're seem to go backwards.
Mm. In Uganda, we're definitely going backwards.
Yeah, and so that means that I, after having worked for quite some years in academia and then in WHO and then with UNAIDS and relying on the health sector only, that I didn't see that we were making any progress. Also, if you want to make a difference in health, you also need the resources. You need the people, you need the money, and that is something that you can't decide for yourself. And it is true that in many countries, a minister of health is not the most powerful politician, although I would say in high-income countries, they often have the largest budget because of social security and in whatever form, National Health Service, whatever it is, Medicare, just name it. But that's a minority of countries. But I think with the COVID epidemic, the importance of this leadership at the top level has become so obvious. And when you look at it, the response in many, many countries was guided out of the office of the prime minister or the president with an essential role for the Ministry of Health. Because what I wouldn't like to see is that as much as I'm a fan and an advocate for top leadership, because that's also health diplomacy, that health should be as important as defense and the economy in any country and globally. What I wouldn't like to see is then that the actual implementation, the operational parts, that belongs in WHO, in the Ministry of Health. So we need, and for example, for pandemic preparedness, WHO has an absolute essential role to play, but we also need at the level of heads of state and government a body that will ensure that there is continued attention. Because I'm very concerned that, one, there's the perception that COVID is over. It's true that it's no longer a public health emergency of the national concern, but there's still people dying every day, every 3 minutes or so. But there will be other pandemics, so that we must make sure that it remains on the agenda, in whatever, of the African Union, of the G20, in national governments, whatever the body is.
One final question on this, and it comes back to what you said about the Japanese, framing this under the context of human security. You and I, at the beginning of the century, had an interesting love-hate relationship with a force of nature in the world of global diplomacy from a US perspective, the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. And he was very clear in his mind that the role here was to put health into a more traditional sense of security. He wanted HIV. It was the first time that a health issue became a subject considered by the Security Council with a lot of opposition. But he would have questioned, I think, he did at the time, I know, question the sort of touchy-feely, carey-sherry, if you excuse me, nature of a human security agenda. And what it brings to mind in talking to you is some advice you gave your senior management team very shortly after I think I joined you back as your chief of staff, that basically UNAIDS was doing judo, another
Asian metaphor, if you'll excuse me, but the idea that we were a mouse and we just needed to learn the right moves and we could throw over the elephant. And so what I see you doing is finding the ways in to different leaders, to different disciplines even, to get to the final goal. And so what for you, after a career in global health, is the final goal? Health equity for all, or?
Well, the first session of this millennium of the UN Security Council in January 2020 was on AIDS, and the first time ever that they discussed a non-traditional security issue was AIDS. And how did we get there? Of course, there was Richard Holbrooke, ambassador, who, because the US had the presidency of the Security Council for the month of January, so and that allows you to set the agenda. But it was based on an analysis that I had made with a number of friends and critics of UNAIDS, because I felt we had not made any progress. And I was trying to think, at the end of the day, what makes a difference and what can move big agendas. And my conclusion was, it is the economy and it is security. And we needed to link up with these agendas. However, I always resisted that to frame, as some have done, particularly in the US, not in Europe at all, AIDS or health as a classic security issue about war and peace and so on. Of course, epidemics historically have sometimes determined the outcome of armed conflicts. We know that. But that's, for me, was a very tricky basis and not sustainable. But I said, yeah, I had read a book about judo, about a small company that can use the weight of a bigger one and put that one on the floor. I didn't want to put anybody on the floor, but making sure we can tap in those bodies, those platforms where the big decisions are made. And frankly, that's where AIDS has really changed completely how we deal with health. Health became on the agenda of the G7, not G20, it took a while, the World Economic Forum, the African Union. It was then called the Organization of African Unity, where President Obasanjo from Nigeria convened a special summit on AIDS. So for me, that was really extremely important. And we need to fight that we keep that we keep health. And not only pandemic preparedness, but health also on the top agenda. And too often health is seen as an expenditure, as a cost in governments. But it is the foundation, it's just as education and well-being of people. And I don't think it's wishy-washy. It's very hard outcome, because when people die, that's you can't think of a harder outcome. And but it has to be well defined. I mean, if you say we want to tackle everything and all the social determinants of health and the commercial determinants and just name it one go, that's paralyzing. So the trick is, I think, is to say, just as with climate change, it is an imminent disaster. It's already happening. What are the 5 things that we really can do to make a difference and mobilize the world around that? And that's one of the jobs of WHO, and I think WHO did that very well now around COVID.
It's interesting you raised COVID, and it's a good point to settle on for a moment. AIDS changed everything. I passionately believe that, and I learned that from you. How has COVID changed things?
I think COVID has made it clear that how vulnerable we are as a human species. That a stupid virus that comes probably from a bat, can disrupt the globe, everything. I mean, and with a huge impact on the economy and so on. What we saw with AIDS was kind of a prefiguration of that. It was, although at the end of the day, AIDS has now killed more people, probably about a double as a COVID, but it's been around for longer. That prime ministers, that heads of state, were forced to deal with it. And many were very uncomfortable with it, and I understand, because we had to deal with a lot of uncertainty. The science was not there yet in the beginning, and we have been very lucky that we had these vaccines. They didn't come out of the, didn't fall out of the sky. It was based on like decades of basic research and so on, but we were lucky. Let's not forget, for HIV, we still don't have a vaccine. And so it has changed the fact that one, health is of overriding importance for the economy, for the nation, not only for individuals. And secondly, I would say second element, and that's probably even more innovative in the eyes of some, is that you can't tackle an epidemic in your country, even if you're an island or a very big country. There is a need for a global approach, certainly for a regional approach. I'm a strong believer that the regions have really emerged as a very important platform and entity to deal with this epidemic, because regions have countries, communities in the same region have more in common with each other than with communities on the other side of the world. That doesn't mean that we don't have universal type of guidance.
You were quite impressed with the way Africa stepped up, and of course our very good friend Michel Sidibé is also part of that movement. He's going to be a guest on the podcast in the next couple of months. Can you talk a bit about how you see Africa's leadership evolving?
I think a silver lining of this pandemic has been and continues the fact that for the first time that I am aware of, that Africa, through the African Union, so at the level of the heads of state with President Ramaphosa, President Kagame, Tshisekedi, the ones who were in charge, and then Africa CDC under the leadership of John Kengasong, a remarkable leadership, that they have not waited for charity coming from the West or the North or whatever we call it these days, to provide with vaccine. They negotiated directly. They put in place diagnostics, sequencing, with support from wealthier countries, that's true, but all under their agenda and negotiating directly with companies. And I think it's for me, the beginning of what I see as a very positive trend, and that is that the responsibility, the decision-making, the policies are set in the region. And we've seen it also in the European Union, because ironically, besides Brexit and Ukraine, but COVID has united Europe, but also because we were lucky to have Ursula von der Leyen as the leader, and we had in the African Union as well. So and that
President of the European Commission,
President of the European Commission, and I must disclose I'm her special advisor on COVID and health now. But what was I going to say? Yeah, and also it has revealed that Africa can no longer rely on the goodwill of others. And for example, just very concretely on vaccines, we all had counted on India as the pharmacy of the world. Plus, let's not forget that Europe has exported hundreds of millions of vaccines, including to low-income countries through COVAX, because we, like Belgium, is the third producer of biopharmaceuticals in the world, but only 11 million people. So we always produce far too many. But when India was confronted with a major epidemic of COVID, Prime Minister Modi decided to use the vaccines for his citizens. And I don't use the word vaccine nationalism and all that. I would have done the same, honestly, because he's elected by Indians. The first job of a head of state or head of government is to deal with the welfare of your citizens while making sure that the rest of the world is not a victim of it. So there's only one option for me to ensure equitable access in the future, because we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. The rest of the world, Asia is just such a producer of medicines and vaccines, is local manufacturing. That doesn't mean in every single country, but that there is manufacturing of vaccines, of essential drugs, of diagnostics in Africa. And that for me is a very important agenda because it will change the power relations, and it will also promote and stimulate economic development. It will keep the trained workforce in the country. And that's also, I'm very proud to say that the EU has allocated over €1 billion to support vaccine manufacturing in Africa. And I'm going next week to Institut Pasteur in Dakar, and they're really ahead. And they have already demonstrated the ability that they can produce vaccines. And the yellow fever vaccine, they've been doing this for decades. Because making vaccines, it's not just about IP and so on. It's a hugely complex process where you have to be absolutely obsessed, let's say passionate, obsessed by quality assurance. Because if you drop one small detail, that can really ruin the whole vaccine. So I think that's, I'm very optimistic that thanks to the COVID epidemic, we'll see this huge shift, a fundamental shift in the power relations in health between, Africa and the rest of the world.
Well, Peter, I mean, what a lovely, upbeat and positive way to bring this interview to a close. I think it's so easy for us to look at the challenges facing the world and think there are no solutions, but I really appreciate that passionate push for the particularly sub-Saharan Africa's leadership, and that you really see it as doable in the short to medium term. Well, I guess it just remains for me to wish you a safe trip to Geneva. Enjoy getting the award. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks for seeing you again and for everything you're trying to communicate on health.
Well, Eric, what did you think? I've got to say, doing that interview, the biggest surprise for me was around how forthright Peter was about the need post-COVID of regional, if not national, local manufacture of vaccines, medications and diagnostics, so that particularly sub-Saharan Africa can be as prepared as possible for whatever is coming, whatever disease X is going to be. Were you surprised by that? And I guess, how do we make that a reality?
I was not surprised by it. I think Peter's correct to put it out there as a critical ingredient to a successful and sustained response, regardless of the disease you're talking about. Pharmaceutical manufacturing capability, the ability to make diagnostics and therapeutics in the region or country that is going to use them facilitates the access need, but you still will need to build that delivery system to reach the patients on a pill and mouth level to ensure that. And that takes a delivery system that stands itself up and remains in place between outbreaks and keeps a population linked. I think that there's no question to me, I was surprised at his emphasis on it, but there's no question to me that having local capability, manufacturing capability, will facilitate access, and we see that in the developed setting everywhere. And I do think we should work for that. It is an important ingredient.
And I think that, given everything that has happened at the UN General Assembly and this focus on leadership of the South, Peter has always been a champion of that. But it was, for me, it was really good to see that reaffirmed. And, particularly his note that our dear friend John Nkayisengang, who of course is now at PEPFAR, was really instrumental in driving that at the Africa CDC. So, yeah, I thought this was an important set of statements from Peter.
No, I think I agree with you. They were important, and I thought they were all thoughtful. I thought his focus on John Nkengasong and his unique relationship with African leadership and the trust that John already has with senior people at the president level will facilitate movement toward expanding into a manufacturing capability, getting external or other investor interest in it, and creating kind of a venture capital network within a region that supports that regional effort to stand up that manufacturing capability. I believe that will be a unique challenge to the pharmaceutical companies to make themselves available to identify molecules and develop those molecules. Once developed, to put them in a manufacturing system that has high quality controls and delivers a pill that does the job.
Well, I guess that's our time up for this episode. I look forward to seeing you next time. Hopefully we can be in person and sit in our nice yellow chairs. Looking forward to that. Take care, Eric.
Thank you, Ben. It's my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see you, talk to you.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks again to my co-host, Eric Goosby. Thanks to Eric Espera, our director and producer from NewsDoc Media. Thanks to our New York producer, Chad Parisman. Our production coordinator is Yvette Raphael. No, it's not. It's Waisha Raphael. I beg your pardon. And we are a project of the Global Listening Project. Please subscribe and give us 5 stars. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you.